We're looking at structure, function, resilience of mainly tropical forest global change. I'm just going to, tropical forests are important, right, for carbon, biodiversity, and cycling of carbon, water, and energy, and that's how they contribute to global climate and regulate global climate. The Amazon is really big, so it's really important. I'm looking at what the fate of these forests change, by which I mean increasing temperatures, we're seeing increased water stress. And, you know, so since I started my PhD in 2010, there have been 5 century, once in a century level droughts. We've had 2 in the last 2 years. I mean, this is getting kind of frankly scary now, right? So we're really putting these ecosystems the test. And, you know, we don't know, where does that resilience stop? They've been resilient so far, we think. But a lot of researchers are now question and talking about tipping points, and will there come a point beyond which Amazon function you know, cannot continue in the same way, and we start to see widespread, or even more widespread, I should say, tree mortality. My research approach is looking at tropical forest structure and function. So those are kind of the responses that I'm looking at in response to these global change drivers. And so I look at forest structure, often using LiDAR, data, forest function, and often what I'm talking about with function is photosynthesis, either at the leaf or the ecosystem scale. And yeah, what I'm trying to do is really have a mechanistic understanding of tropical forests from, as I said, the leaf to the ecosystem scale. And so much of my work, I've looked at these 2 things, forest structure and function, in isolation, but where I want to get to is kind of integration. And that's what I'll talk about towards the end, is, you know, hoping to get to that integration. So I'll start with a couple of stories about forest function and the work I've done on that. And then I'll move on to my work on forest structure, and then finally finish with how I'm changing, how I'm measuring forest function, forest structure, namely moving into 3-dimensional realm. And then sort of, you know, I'd love to get your feedback as well on how, you know, we could start doing kind of an integration of that 3-dimensional structure and function. So firstly, to start off with a story about the impacts of high temperatures on forest function, namely forest photosynthesis. So this was a paper that we published in 2020 in Nature Plants, entitled Empirical Evidence for Resilience of Tropical Forest Photosynthesis in a Warmer World. And so, you know, we know that photosynthesis declines above the thermal optimum, but there's a couple of mechanisms that might explain that. It could be due to an increase in vapor pressure deficit, VPD, or you basically think of that as being air dryness. And so, you know, VPD and temperature are strongly correlated. And so as temperature goes up, the leaves close their stomata to prevent water, basically. Alternatively, it could be that, yeah, the leaves just get kind of cooked, and the photosynthetic machinery is damaged seriously, irrevocably, and you know, that function then would cease to happen. But as I indicated, it's really hard to get at this question because VPD and temperature are really strongly linked in natural systems. So yeah, it hadn't been addressed in quite the way that we could do it. Might seem like we're kind of splitting hairs now, like, does it really matter what the mechanism is? Well, I'll explain towards the end, but just know that one of these options, or hypothesis 1, would allow for continued function under a scenario that I will explain, whereas hypothesis 2, you're just not going to have any more function, the leaf's kind of done, you can't really go back from that. So it is important. And during my PhD, I was really fortunate to have data from the Biosphere 2 tropical forest. It's an experimental forest mesocosm run by the University of Arizona, and it may not come to as a surprise to you that a tropical forest under glass in the desert is probably the hottest tropical forest in the world. So we were able to test, you know, that was really helpful. We could test the response of tropical forests to future climates. And we could also use this controlled environmental system, where we could manipulate the sensitivity of vapor pressure deficit, or air dryness to temperature by adding more humidity through their air handlers or humidifiers. And the moisture, the kind of humidity gets trapped in that structure. So that's what we did, and we compared the net ecosystem exchange. Basically forest photosynthetic responses from natural forests in Mexico and 3 in the Amazon to the data from the Biosphere 2 forest. And so this is just to show you what that VPD response to temperature looks like. And you can see in Biosphere 2, it's much shallower. And even for high temperatures, the mean VPD is much lower, whereas quite relationship in the natural forest sites. And yeah, what did we see? Well, we saw that natural forest sites, the GEP or the forest photosynthesis declined about 28 degrees Celsius. But in Biosphere 2, where VPD remains low, even at high temperatures, photosynthesis continued up to about 38 degrees Celsius, which is quite impressive. So this is consistent with that first hypothesis that it's stomatal control that basically is leading to those high temperature declines in photosynthesis. We also looked at the response of photosynthesis to VPD, and there the responses of all the forests are very consistent. So all of this is evidence for the first hypothesis, that VPD rather than temperature, directly is the major driver of high temperature declines in photosynthesis. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a potentially good news story. Like it potentially shows kind of increased resilience, or that these forests have higher resilience than we might have thought. And so there's, not certain that this mechanism would come into play. There's more research that needs to be done on it, but one of the expectations is that water use efficiency should increase under higher CO2 concentrations. So, for the stomates the plants will lose less water basically, but be able to get the same amount of carbon into the leaf, and so that's how this resilience mechanism could play out. So yeah, potential there at least for continued function, but we do need to do more work on that side to see if that hypothesis actually bears out. And there is some evidence for it that's been shown. And so yeah, just sort of a tag on to this story is that I'm collaborating with Pedro Tyan Taylor and Valery Ivanov, and they're looking at these responses at the leaf level photosynthesis to temperature and VPD. And it's quite interesting because at the moment it's showing quite different results to what we saw at the ecosystem level. So, why is that? It could be to do with the hydrology of the trees. That's different, and they've got sap flow sensors, so they're going to be able to take that into account. And it also could be a species effect that it really matters to the ecosystem level, like who you've got in your community. So that will be quite interesting if we can actually kind of integrate those stories and figure out how to understand the leaf to the ecosystem scaling. Cool. So another forest function story is that I'm a key collaborator on a big US National Science Foundation grant that's investigating the influence of soil water availability on Amazon forest drought responses. And this is work that I'm doing with Scott Stark, Flavia Costa, and Juliana Sketchy. And this is, I think, really interesting, and it's a dimension of Amazon forest drought that hasn't been worked on until recently, and that is, we've thought a lot about precipitation inputs, but like, what about soil water? I think it's like an axis that has been really underappreciated. And so in this work, we're testing what we call the other side of tropical forest drought. And this is the hypothesis that the shallow water table depth regions of Amazonia may actually, benefit from some level of drought and could end up being large-scale hydrological refugia from drought. So just to acquaint you here, we have gradients of soil water in the Amazon, maybe shallow water table depth regions where it sounds like the water close to the tree roots. For most of the year, the tree roots will be in the very close proximity. And then deep water table depth regions where, yeah, it sounds the water table is far away from most of the tree roots, although some of the big trees may have roots that can access that deep soil water. And so, yeah, interestingly, we've done analyses of this, and we can see that most of the permanent plot networks are distributed over the deep water table depth regions. But they only account, according to this analysis that we did, I did as part of the Tanzania review paper we published, they only account for about 8% of the basin by area, whereas the shallow water table depth forest shown in blue here account for about 50% by area of the basin. So yeah, that's pretty important, isn't it? And yet, yeah, they're underrepresented in research networks. They've been kind of understudied, and there's increasing evidence, especially from Juliana and Flavia's groups, that they may have contrasting positive drought responses. And yeah, so you could check out the Tanzania review paper. And how would this happen? Well, if you think about these areas, they're quite waterlogged, anoxic for much of the year, and so under some level of drying, moderate drying, you can imagine how that might be really helpful, bring more oxygen into the system and actually extend the growing period. And so, yeah, one of the hypotheses that we hope to soon have data to be able to test is whether the increased productivity of these shallow water table depth regions might actually offset the carbon losses. So these are carbon losses coming from the deep water table depth forests. There's kind of a question mark over how resilient these shallow water table depth regions be. But yeah, if we can kind of lower, if they could offset some of the losses expected from tree mortality in the deep water table depth areas, that would be good and an important thing to quantify. So not to say too much on the slide, but yeah, we've instrumented deep and shallow water table plots near Hazava and along the BR319 road, and data is incoming. And we have a PhD student, Kate Heafy, who is working on this project, and she's in the Amazon right now collecting data. And one of the questions that she's looking at in one of her chapters is what limits dry season growth, stem growth. And this is quite interesting because stem growth in the deep water table depth sites tends to happen in the rainy season. But like, why is that? Is it because it's a water limitation thing, or is it because it's a carbohydrate competition thing from leaf growth, which tends to happen in the dry season? And so she's using measurements of dominant trees over the deep and shallow water table depth plots to try and kind of tease apart this question, as well as measuring the major components of carbon allocation. So leaf flush, she's measuring the water status of the tree with sap flow, measuring the stem growth with dendrometers, and looking at roots as well, which is a ton of work. I never appreciated how much work root growth work is, but she said that's important, and she's right. So so hopefully we should get a sense of, yeah, what these patterns are and what's driving the timings of this carbon allocation to these different organs. And she's got microenvironmental measurements as well. So not a ton of data to show. This is more just to say data's coming in. This is some of the sort of early root data, but yeah, as soon as she comes back from the field, I'm sure she'll be cranking on the analyses. Okay, pause for breath here. So, but we have published some work on this other side of drought hypothesis. As I said, the data from the plots is coming in and being worked on actively, but this was a remote sensing analysis led by Shuli Chen at the University of Arizona that I was excited to be a part of. She did a great job in basically testing this mechanism using a satellite measured enhanced vegetation index, or EVI. And as you might know, this is an index which indicates canopy greenness or photosynthetic capacity activity. And she evaluated drought responses using EVI data across water table depths in the Amazon, which hadn't been done before. And in doing so, just to give you a bit of context, there's been this kind of long-standing debate raging in Amazon forest drought responses literature, whereby my PhD supervisor, Scott Saleska, in 2007 published this paper in Science, showing that at least from the remote sensing perspective, using EVI, the EVI index, the forests seemed to green up after the 2005 drought, which was perplexing because you think, well, forests shouldn't be doing very well during drought, but we thought, well, maybe they have access to that, they have deep roots and they have access to soil water, and then the increase in sunlight, means that they can green up and take advantage of that, be more productive. On the other hand, Oliver Phillips and colleagues published this paper a couple of years later, showing drought sensitivity from the forest plot network, the rainfall network. So very high and widespread mortality, tree mortality on the ground for the same drought. So, this is very confusing, right? Like what's going on here? Satellite measures show resilience to drought. On the ground measures show vulnerability. And in steps Shuyi Chen, and I'll show you why her analysis sort of helped to resolve that really. So what she did was to analyze a 20-year time series of EVI, and that encompassed 3 once-in-a-century droughts. We probably need to call them something else now, don't we? Because we're having them so often. And so the red parts are, highest drought impact. You're basically looking at precipitation anomalies here. And then she looked at the EVI data. So again, this is indicating canopy photosynthetic capacity or activity. And where you see areas of green, that's areas of green up where we think that there's, that codes for higher photosynthesis. And where there's areas of red, it's known as brown down, so areas where there should be lower photosynthetic activity, and potentially, if you went on the ground, maybe mortality. We can't tell that from this measure. So I think, what's really cool about this study is that a lot of work treats the Amazon as like one thing, and it's clearly not. Like, it's a really diverse system. And but Shuyi basically broke up her analysis into different regions, or what she termed Amazon forest ecotopes that were defined by kind of specific ecological and environmental characteristics. And this enabled her to identify different mechanisms that control the drought response and lead to different responses of the forest in different areas. So yeah, I think it's a big step forward in our understanding of Amazon forest drought. And so one of the regions, I'm just going to talk about 2 of them, although she divided it up into 3 regions, but the southern Amazon region, which is this high fertility area, she tested the other side of drought hypothesis and found, yes, it does, the drought response is structured by water table depth. So here, this is, you can think of this as water table depth, where the shallow water table depth forests are on the left and the deep water table depth forests are on the right. And so higher on the y-axis is more greening, lower on the axis more negative is more browning. So you can see that basically the shallow water tables forests are showing greening, whereas there's sort of higher vulnerability, more browning on the other end of the graph. And so, yeah, this is pretty interesting, right? Because this is getting back to that debate between what we were seeing from satellite and forest plot data. And she was able to see that the areas that were browning down were different areas than were greening up. So that kind of resolved that debate based on the remote sensing data. But then also she did analyze forest plot data. And you also see higher mortality in the deep water depth areas as compared to the shallow water depth areas. So yeah, kind of, I think, quite nailed that controversy both in terms of the remote sensing data and the forest plot analysis. However, in the northern region, we didn't find evidence for the other side of drought. hypothesis. Yeah, basically it's not structured by water table depth. And we think that that's because in this less fertile region, yeah, we know that lower fertility areas, trees tend to invest more in drought resistance traits. So yeah, they're not sort of relying on the water table as much. They're relying on their kind of conservative traits to weather those droughts, as it were. And in some parts, we know that there's very tall trees, such as in the Guyana Shield, and we think that that correlates with deep rooting. So yeah, presumably they're able to access deep water even during drought. So yeah, this analysis that Shuli did, again, looking at these distinct forest ecotypes, defined by specific environmental and ecological characteristics, enabled her to basically produce a map showing the dominant driver of the drought response in each of the areas. So whether it was due to water table depth or soil fertility or forest height or rooting depth. So that's what you're seeing there. And her modelling also enabled her to produce a map of forest vulnerability or resilience to drought, which, you know, I think is a really nice product to come out of this paper, and something that hopefully will be important for conservation planning and understanding, obviously, future function of the Amazon. And just to note that, you know, so these are areas of effectively more intrinsically vulnerable. This has been talking, obviously, Bernardo Flores and et al.'s work about sort of extrinsic factors like deforestation. It doesn't speak to that, but you know there is overlap there because it's right by the arc of deforestation. So yeah, even more reason to protect forests at that end, especially seeing as that sort of trade winds come and a lot of that moist air generated by the forest will then go down towards the agriculturally important areas of Brazil. So yeah, important to have that context. Cool. So moving on to forest structure. And then, yeah, we'll kind of wrap up by thinking about how we could start combining these two aspects of forest structure with the function. Work I published in 2019 looked at the impacts of seasonal and anomalous water stress on forest structure. And I guess sort of the other link to this is now we're going to delve through the vertical profile, which is, I guess, one of my shticks, right? Like remote sensing is great, but I think there's more to the forest canopy than just the surface. And indeed, we did show that there's quite distinct dynamics of the vertical canopy structure, and it could be really important to consider that when you're trying to predict forest responses to climate. So for this work, I used a two-dimensional profiling canopy LiDAR. And what it does is basically give you kind of a two-dimensional slice through the forest. So you have fully vertically resolved information along the transect. And what you're looking at is the quantity of leaves along that transect, or leaf area density. And yeah, just if people aren't clear, LiDAR uses pulses of laser light to basically just measure the distances to objects and generate, well, now we can generate very detailed three-dimensional reconstructions of forest. This is a more rudimentary instrument, but still we were able to do some cool things with it. And this study took place in the Tapajós National Forest, which is kind of in the central eastern Amazon and is one of the driest parts of the moist Amazon forest. So we had 4 years of monthly LiDAR measurements, including through a drought. And one of the things I'm going to show you quite a lot is a leaf area profile, which I like to think of as like a fingerprint for a forest. Every forest has kind of a different profile, and it can indicate a lot about its history. Anyway, it's just the mean leaf area density at each height. So we looked at this forest structural data in a couple of different ways. We looked at it according to a simple like lower upper canopy distinction, just based on some height above the ground. But then we also tried to look at it in terms of light environments. So we generated these light environment layers, which each one is just a different distance away from the local canopy surface. So layer 1 is the highest light surface layer, and down to layer 4, which is the kind of the understory or darkest layer. And we thought that this was a good thing to do because you can imagine that a leaf in the understory here is going to have quite a different microenvironment to a leaf at the same height, but like in a canopy gap here. So that might give us really, good ideas on, why these different dynamics are happening. So I don't have time to go through all the results, but just to focus on one, which is kind of the dynamics during the strongest part of the 2015 drought. So this is the initial profile for this period at the middle of the dry season in 2015. And then now what we're going to look at is the difference between profiles from the mid to the end of the dry season, so period of greatest water stress. The black line here shows you the difference in the total profile, and then the different colored lines are those depth layers. So the red is the highest surface layer, and the purple is the understory layer. And this was pretty interesting. We saw an upper canopy increase across all of those light layers. But we saw divergent responses in the lower canopy. So small trees at the surface lost leaf area, whereas small trees in the understory increased in leaf area. And yeah, we thought that these divergent responses probably pointed to contrasting tree size and functional groups mediated by ecohydrology and microenvironment. So you've got, yeah, kind of differences in water status, probably because larger trees have deep roots. So, even, and we saw this in kind of, well, explaining the upper canopy increase, those big trees have access to deep soil water, even during drought. But, it's really important to consider these microenvironments of small trees, because presumably that canopy, the surface layer of small trees and gaps is going to be quite a stressful environment, whereas the understory is more protected and then could kind of leaf out. But yeah, still more data needs to be collected to kind of corroborate these microenvironmental hypotheses really. But yeah, pretty interesting to see these very pronounced dynamics according to height and microenvironment, and just something I think that we need to think about in how we're modeling Amazon forest productivity. Yeah, I probably should move on. So yeah, the next sort of thrust of my research is really understanding the impacts of land use change on forest structure and microclimates. So yeah, similar approach, but yeah, now looking at yeah, lots of different disturbance types. And this for this I used a ground-based LiDAR database, so it's the same kind of 2D profiling LiDAR, but this has been used by a ton of my collaborators, and so we came together and put all this data from about 370 plots together, and it's a nice data set, encompasses quite a lot of environmental gradients across the Amazon, but also disturbance types as well. So it enabled us to ask whether different disturbance types result in distinct structural impacts. And also a question I'm really interested in, we've been talking about this, David, what are the kind of distinctions or similarities between anthropogenically disturbed forests and natural forests? And ultimately, if we can answer these questions, like it could be really helpful for monitoring, yeah, disturbance impacts remotely, being able to say what the disturbance type was, that kind of thing. So I generated a bunch of metrics, some kind of traditional ones, some sort of more novel ones, getting at like light environment, things like that. And the sort of analysis design was that I looked at a bunch of different disturbance types and identified plots that were nearby undisturbed sort of plots that I could compare the disturbed forest to. So the disturbed forests are shown in red, the control or undisturbed forests are shown in blue. And again, don't have time to go through kind of all of the results, but the kind of key take homes were we did see, obviously, as you expect, significant structural impacts of disturbance. But generally, except for the most extreme disturbance types, which was like fire and Igapo, the seasonally flooded forest, the response was like a rearrangement of the vertical distribution of leaf area rather than reducing the total leaf area. So mostly we saw, and often we saw a reduction in upper canopy leaf area. And, you know, a lot of these forests we were measuring like 10 or 20 years after disturbance. So there had been time for a recovery or regeneration response. But yeah, just to sort of quickly answer one of those questions that I asked, I didn't really see distinct impacts, which I thought was interesting, but maybe because there'd been some time for recovery. So it was more like we could distinguish the disturbances by the magnitude, but not really the kind of flavor of the structural impacts. And this analysis was quite illuminating, really, for highlighting the similarity of structure of disturbed forests to undisturbed forests. So this is an output of a hierarchical clustering analysis on principal components, where I've included 11 structural metrics. And basically, it's a way of just kind of comparing like structural similarity between forest plots. So here we've got the red dots are the disturbed forests, and the blue and the grey are all kind of undisturbed, mature, primary, whatever you want to call it, forests. And so, yeah, you can see that, you know, there tend to be more undisturbed forests in this cluster, tend to see more disturbed forests cropping up here. And then you do have a cluster that's very distinct, and this is where, you know, we saw the biggest structural impacts. But, you know, there's actually not very much distinguishing these, you know, clusters 2 and 3. And, you know, so we kind of concluded, well, this is, again, looks quite good news. These forests seem to be recovering after some period after disturbance, like maybe 10, 30 years in some cases. Yeah, but quite interesting that structurally these disturbed forests aren't often looking that different. And as with many things, this just generated more questions than maybe were answered. But this is what what we're working towards now is like, okay, so you can have forests that now look similar structurally, but like, what does that mean functionally? And, you know, who's there, like in terms of the species? Do you have, do you have a shift there in the species as well? Yeah, and ultimately, you know, can we predict structure? Can we predict function from structure? And are those structure function relationships fundamentally different in disturbed forests? Like, do we have to come up with kind of different relationships, or not? Like, are there kind of uniform rules defining those relationships? So yeah, this is the final part. Thanks for bearing with me thus far. I know it's a lot to go through, but yeah, my kind of next frontier that I'm working on in my group and my collaborators, and it'd be great to get your thoughts, because I think there's a few people here are thinking about this already. But the next frontier, like 3D structure and function, like what does that enable us to do, and how can we start mapping on forest function to, yeah, 3-dimensional structure? Hezwin Bai, Masters by Research student, working with myself and John Healy, has been really leading the charge on this, and now switched gears to UK forests in Wales. This is research funded by Wood Knowledge Wales, which is a really cool organisation that's really promoting a sustainable use of homegrown timber. And Hezwin's research is really, in line with this centre and this seminar series, because he is really trying to see whether terrestrial laser scanning, so terrestrial LiDAR, could accurately and efficiently quantify tree volume and carbon in farm woodlands. And so, yeah, why is this important? Well, these are quite marginalized areas, but they could be really important potentially for timber, and especially if we want to, have more homegrown timber, we might want to find ways to maximize the efficiency of wood production coming from those areas. So Heather measured a bunch of plots with TLS, the terrestrial LiDAR, and we deliberately used a kind of gradient of forest complexity so that we could sort of see what the limits are of this method. And he compared the TLS measurements against regular tree measurements, DBH and height and so on, as well as a timber value categorization by an expert consultant. So he, segmented the point clouds, used 3D Fin to extract the metrics, the tree structural metrics, and he identified key metrics that should be important in determining timber value, such as the lean and taper and DBH, all of that good stuff. And then developed this log selection algorithm, which basically goes through and for each tree identifies like how many logs of which quality you could get out of that tree. So it's very nice, and he's got calculated the total timber value and the carbon for each tree as well. So key take homes, TLS can do it. That's good, and it agrees well with the traditional measurements of DBH and height as you would expect. It also agrees well. TLS did a good job of correlating with the expert tree consultant who was valuing according to these sort of categorical bins. So this is sort of a high value tree, this is a lower value tree, and this is kind of consultant TLS. And it might be important to think about how TLS could maybe change that categorization. Maybe we could use more of a continuous way of categorizing tree timber value. And also TLS had good agreement for the carbon estimation from allometries as well. So I think it's really exciting. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts here. That we could use TLS sort of a proof of concept for quantifying timber value and carbon in these even quite poorly managed or undermanaged areas, maybe I should say, and then thus enhance the value retention of otherwise underutilized woodlands. And we could even go in and measure before we fell, right? And then a farmer could have that information before deciding what they would like to do. We could use this type of data for helping to improve forest management of those areas as well. So finally, moving on to the kind of the other aspect of this final frontier, which is or next frontier, which is myself and my collaborators listed there, trying to develop a mobile laser scanning method for measuring 3D forest structure. And so MLS is a bit different from TLS because you walk around with the LiDAR, so it's capturing 3D information, but you're walking around with it. And this kind of appealed to us because it's more similar to the two-dimensional LiDAR we've been using previously. But now we have access to, like all of this information, which kind of is making my head boggle and still trying to think what we can do with it. Headwinds led the charge on trying to figure out how to process this. And so that's sort of an example of voxelization as part of the data processing. Okay, so TLS is amazing, right? Like the work that's been done on that is just incredible, like fine scale, tree structure, individual trees. But, we're more interested, I think, in forest level measurements. We're often going to like really quite remote places. So, having a lighter, quicker measurement, something that doesn't need so many people and can be replicated maybe more easily is really appealing. So that's why MLS. And then, these are some of the things that would be great to hear your thoughts on, but what we're thinking that we could do with this, carbon's great, we all love carbon, but like, what are the ecological questions that we can address with this data? You know, how much more does it tell us? I think it's going to tell us some more things, but yeah, we're still figuring out what those are. Can it help us get to mechanisms that we couldn't get at before? Certainly the light environments, opportunities, and really, you know, modeling detailed light environments is really exciting. Can we do more work connecting 3D forest structure and biodiversity? What metrics might help us understand, you know, might be important for different taxa? And, you know, really what we want to be doing is linking forest structure to forest function and functional traits and functional compositions. So yeah, and you know, maybe that's we do that through sort of 3D modeling of the forest biophysics, from you know getting the data from these real 3D representations of the forests. And of course, yeah, you've already seen Heswin's work on the timber properties, but yeah, more to be done there as well. So yeah, that's come to the end. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll finish with yeah, acknowledging my partner institutions and funding sources. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much, Marielle. We have time for questions, and of course, those online, it's easier probably if you type any questions you have.
Maybe I'll leave it here because that's a sort of, you know, people
Yes.
have thoughts. Slide.
Maybe a question from the room first.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. Very interesting. You say Kate Keefe?
Kate Keefe, yeah.
You said you're doing like repeat scan individual crown.
Oh, she's using drones, so it's RGB, yeah, images. So she's she's creating masks of the images and then extracting GCC, kind of greenness text. Yeah, to look, well, particularly looking, we want to understand like new flushing of new leaves, is what GCC can help us get at.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's exactly what I was doing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, you probably know much more than I do then.
No, I'm just interested to hear about the kind of the scale and how.
So, you know, oh yeah. So it's a question about what we're doing with measuring the crown leaf flush, and we're using drones. This is Kate Heafy's work in the Amazon. So yeah, I don't think we'll end up with the idea would be a full year, but as you know, it takes a while to get things up and running. And to even learn how to fly a drone in tropical forest is quite challenging. And then to, you know, get really good images of each crown and then be able to replicate it and see which crown is the one for your study tree, all these fun things. But yeah, basically every month would be the idea for, I think she's got 18 study trees in the 2 sites. And so yeah, just one image for each month, for each crown. So yeah, we'll see how that works. I'd love to talk to you about what you did maybe afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. We've gone through a lot of pain to where we are now. So
yeah, okay, be good to. Yeah, thank you.
Sort of interesting. I didn't really know much about that importance of how deep the water table was, and I was just wondering how applicable is that outside of just the Amazonian system, and then also in maybe the case of tree planting, is that a big consideration in terms of both the species and the locations of where we need to be?
Like, so for the soil water in terms of tree
If
planting.
you were planting it in an area with a really small water table or a really large table, how that may be correct.
Yeah, okay, so the first question, applicability, I mean, I'm sure it is. I probably should know more, but I don't, about what's been done in other tropical forests on the soil water side of things. But yeah, I mean, it is mind-blowing that we haven't really, I mean, except for Flavia and Juliana, who've been working on kind of soil water for a long time. So they've got this crazy like 700 kilometer transect with like 11 plots going southwest from Manaus along the BR319, and that's a really like widespread shallow water table depth area. So that increases the number of plots in these areas by like a lot. But except for that, you know, it's been kind of like a blind spot. And so it's interesting, isn't it? We think about precipitation a lot as an input. It's not the only way that trees are getting water. So, I mean, I can't help but think that that's really important. I don't know, David, do you know about the soil, water and other parts?
I have a PhD in Venezuela. PhD in state, unfortunately. The Amazonian fingers, so it's that white sand forest. As the water table gets shorter there, near the surface there, the forests just come right back down and they become crumbling. So it's, I don't know much about the sort of fertile of forests, but I think very, very good. I don't know, when the talk was really interesting, and I'm probably thinking that do we know about how deep those roots go, because that seems so critical to the story, but I don't know very many people who have worked on that.
I know. Yeah, and as soon as exactly. As soon as Kate started her PhD, we sort of were walking around the forest together in the Tapajos, and she was kind of asking me these questions. Like, I don't know. And then we'd see tree falls, and so we'd try and we're thinking, oh, could we make measurements on those fallen trees? You know, at least the taproot's gone that far down into the ground because you can measure that much of it. Like, would that be a useful thing to start a database of that? But I mean, then there's the like the Fan and Migues Macho papers. They produced a nice one in PNS a few years ago, and I think there was one tree that went down, I can't remember now, like 70 meters or something crazy. So I don't know, like the water table in the Tapajos we think goes down at about 100 meters. And I'm trying to remember that Daniel Nepstad measured one of the trees and it went down like tens of meters. I can't remember now, but yeah, so but who knows like how regular that is. I mean, and I'm not involved in tree planting, but I can only imagine that that's really important to think about. And just to say, like, I do know that there are species that are found in both deep and shallow water tables. So I guess that would be maybe something you could think about, is trees that have more, like can exist over a broader range of environmental factors. I'll have to be looking out for papers and seeing what everybody else is doing in other parts. I'm going to Borneo soon, so I probably should think about what people have done there on these water table issues.
Just wondering about how stable the water table are. Is there a seasonal variation, and do the strong drought have an impact on the water table itself, other than just?
Yeah, that's a really, oh, sorry. The question was about how much variability there is in water table depth. And this one is running out of battery, but hopefully it'll be good. So yeah, no, that's really, really spot on, because that's a key axis of variation, which Flavia and Juliana are also working on. And it seems to explain mortality, differences in mortality rates. I'll just do that again. Yeah, so unfortunately we don't have data, as much data as we would want, measuring that variability. So they've got measurements along some of the BR 319 plots that I mentioned, but yeah, it does seem to be really, really important. And I'm trying to remember in which direction it went now, whether it was I think you do. I think it's better, if you I think you do better as a forest through drought if you're less variable, and you have a shallow water table. I think that was a key finding. But it's super important. You need to take that into account as well.
If anyone online has any questions, you can put them in the chat. But I had a quick question about 2007 and 9 Nature Science papers, and then your follow-up focusing on this breeding variable. And of course, there's like a whole suite of new variables in the way we can measure tree physiology and performance using remote sensing. Have you kind of gone back to those original kind of premises of those studies and thought how water table depth, etc., might change some of these other parameters?
Which premises?
Well, I mean, there are many different kinds of parameters, aren't there, around kind of tree photosynthetic potential, etc. I'm not going to profess to be a knowledgeable of all of them, but these remote sensing techniques now allow us to get a lot of different variables that weren't accessible 20 years back.
Well, so I'm trying to remember, what did she do now? She did like a whole associated analysis using SIF actually. Yeah, so she did actually do the remote sensing, the same analysis on SIF, and it showed the same thing. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions in my view of what SIF is actually showing us, but so that's one way to answer a question, I think. And then if I understood correctly, you were also thinking about kind of the on the ground measurements and how that correlated. Yeah, so I mean, Chewy did do that in her paper, and that was, I think, a really nice sort of literally grounding part of it, that she did find that the ground-based data agreed, you know, in terms of the mortality rates being higher and the deeper water table depth forest. And she also compared her resilience map against, let me just see if I can find it, because I'm now going to forget the name of the metric, which is terrible. But basically a water status metric, and that also agreed. Yeah, so there were a couple of ways in which she sort of corroborated the remote sensing data against the against the ground-based data. Sorry, I'm just blanking on what that metric is called. It's basically your ability to withstand droughts hydrologically, measured from the ground.
And I guess
A follow-on from thinking about mortality is thinking about kind of growth rates and those kind of potentials. How do you think that might be affected by this water table fluctuation?
So Eric Esteban's work is on that, and he did his PhD with Flavia, and I think I'm right in saying that there wasn't like a big increase in terms of like the growth, but it was more like a positive in terms of lower mortality rates. Still need to just keep working on it, I guess. Come back and be able to tell more later.
All right, well, I think we'll leave it there and just say once again a massive thank you to Marielle for a really interesting talk. And our next speaker will be on the first Thursday of May, and it's Matt Betts from Oregon State University, and he'll be talking, I think it's at 4 p.m. UK time, which is still pretty early in Oregon. Anyway, so thanks again.
Thank you so much.